For my 22nd birthday, I decided to organize a camping trip with several of my college friends. The idea was to spend a weekend camping in a mountainous area that was about 12 kilometers outside the city. The last time I had been to that place was when I was about 9 years old. At that time I went along with my parents and we had a really great time, so I had always wanted to go back there. But for one reason or another, I had not had the opportunity until that moment. At first I had invited about 5 or 6 of my classmates, but then others wanted to join, and finally we ended up being a group of 11. After organizing everything on Friday morning, we met at a point in the city to go from there. The access to this area was quite difficult, so it was only possible to enter with rustic vehicles and only up to a point. Then from there, we had to follow a path on foot until we reached the camp. The journey took about 3 hours, but when we arrived at the place I was really surprised. Although it was the same place, it was nothing like what I remembered, as this place seemed to be completely abandoned. The parking lot was dirty, full of leaves and debris that seemed to have been left there half a century ago, and weeds had claimed almost the entire place, plus we seemed to be the only ones there. Overall, this was nothing like the campground I remembered, but at least the mountain was still just as spectacular and imposing, although in this stillness, it had a somewhat somber air. As we got out of the cars, my friends looked at each other. Obviously, this was not as I had described it to them, but no one said anything, probably not to make me feel bad. But I did get a little embarrassed. However, there is never lacking the enthusiastic friend who puts a good vibe to everything, and in our case, that was Sophia. She got out of the car clapping her hands and shouting, "Hey, what are you princesses waiting for? We need to start taking things down. We have a trail to hike and a whole mountain to ourselves." Don't you think that's great? It's amazing how sometimes one person can change the mood of a whole group in a second. Immediately everyone started to put things down, then we hung up our backpacks and started the hike. But as we went along, I actually had a little trouble getting my bearings because I could hardly recognize the place. In the past, the trees were healthier, the bushes were denser, the foliage was more colorful and beautiful, and the hiking trails used to go through the woods all around the area. But now the trails were completely overgrown with brush. It seemed that for some reason, people forgot about this area, and it had been closed for years, so the forest naturally took it all back. My fellow campers were not happy about it, but it was what it was and we were already there, so we moved on. When we finally arrived at the camping area, it was no different from the rest. It was abandoned and neglected like everything else, so we had to weed a good stretch before setting up the tents. However, coupled with the disappointment of having found a completely different place than I had imagined, my friends began to behave like unsupervised children. Probably seeing that there was no one around, and just as Sophia said, we had the mountain to ourselves, they started to behave like real idiots and were very disrespectful to nature. I mean, they started to pull branches from the trees because they were supposedly in the way. They drank beer in excess, threw empty cans into the forest, and even distributed embers from the campfire in the rest of the camp, just to play with the fire, watching it light and extinguish it. They were out of control, literally breaking every possible rule. I got annoyed with them and told them to stop, but they more or less just handed me a beer and told me to calm down. And since I had gotten them into a freaking jungle, at least let them have fun. I tried to enjoy my time, but it was impossible with these assholes. A couple of female companions were also angry about the way they were behaving, but beyond that there was something else. I felt like a strange energy that I couldn't explain. The truth is that I felt uneasy, and I didn't really know why. When night finally came, I decided to go to bed earlier. My idiotic friends, drunk to the core, started to boo me and tell me that I was a party pooper, but I didn't listen to them. I didn't feel physically tired, but I was in a bad mood, and everyone was talking very loud and shouting nonsense. I was really stressed. At one point I fell asleep and woke up a few hours later. I didn't know exactly what time it was, but it was late, and now everything was completely silent. It was as if the whole forest was taking a breather as everyone got quiet and fell asleep. I stood there for a while listening to the murmurs of the night forest, the sound of the crickets, the frogs, the leaves on the trees moving in the wind. There's something very soothing about that, and I seemed to be the only one awake at the time. Suddenly I felt like peeing and crawled out of the tent. Then I walked to the tree line around the camp, and as I did so, I kept looking deep into the forest. There were only trees and underbrush. But when I focused my eyes, I realized there was something else. I could see a silhouette in the trees ahead. It was a person, and as I got closer, I could see her more clearly. At that moment, the moon was clear, so I hadn't turned on my flashlight. I took it out of my pocket to see the person and pointed the light towards the background. Then I could see her clearly. It was Sophia. She was dressed exactly the same as a while ago, but now she was in profile looking towards nothing. "Sophie," I called out to her, but she didn't look at me. "Sophie, you who?" I asked her loudly as I approached her. Her attitude was very strange. She seemed to be lost. When I was about 10 or 15 feet away from her, I asked her again, "Hey, what are you doing out there alone? In this cold and in the middle of this darkness, aren't you scared?" She turned to look at me, smiled at me in a strange way, and said, "Do you want me to show you something scary?" A creepy smile spread even wider across her face, and then she waved for me to follow her. I was completely speechless and wide-eyed as my heart began to race. It was then that I noticed something else strange. At that moment, we were about 13 feet away, and my flashlight, which has a very powerful light, was shining directly into her face, enough to make her eyes squint and frown, but her expression was completely relaxed and her eyes wide open too. But not only that, but the light didn't seem to be reflecting off her irises. They were completely black and I couldn't even see her pupils. It was very creepy. Suddenly she turned around, looked over her shoulder at me with the same devilish grin, and waved me to follow her again as she began to walk deeper into the forest. I was completely paralyzed. For an instant I was about to follow her, but I only took a couple of steps and stopped. Sophia and I got along very well, and I was quite fond of her, but she was acting too strangely, and I honestly felt very afraid. As I watched her walk away, I started to call out for her to come back, starting to think that maybe she had too much to drink or maybe she had smoked something weird. But instead of following her to bring her back, fear got the better of me. So I went back to the camp to wake up the guys to tell them what had just happened and that we should go look for her. But in doing so, I got an even scarier surprise. I went into one of the tents where Marcus and Jeremy were supposed to be. Then I started hitting them on their legs to wake them up and told them about Sophia, hurrying them to get out of the tent and come with me to look for her. But then, they looked at each other strangely, and then looked to the side of the tent where there was another person asleep. And when I looked over there, I was completely petrified. It was Sophia. She was now waking up and asked what was going on. "What the hell?" I mumbled, as my eyes went wide with astonishment. My head started spinning and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. The guys were looking at me like I had gone crazy. I started walking backwards, shaking my head, completely bewildered and now much more scared. The three of them came out of the store looking at me like I was insane and asking me what the hell was wrong with me. But I was so confused and terrified that I couldn't even articulate a sentence until I finally started to runtedly tell them what had just happened to me. The two idiots started laughing, while Sophia asked me how much beer I had drunk. "Not a single one," I replied, half angry and panicked at the same time. Hey, what crazy shit are you talking about? Are you a lunatic? I don't know what you smoked, but it was the bad stuff. I'm not crazy. I know what I just saw, and it was real. I yelled at them in a fit. They told me I was hallucinating and to go back to my tent, but there was no way I was going back to sleep. Instead, I sat by the fire and stoked the coals while nervously looking around. I lay awake the rest of the night terrified, thinking that this specter or demon or whatever I saw might come back. I was paranoid the whole time. Every sound I heard sent a shiver of pure adrenaline through my body, and as soon as I saw the first ray of sunshine, I woke everyone up and made them pack their things to go home. At first, no one took me seriously. They even tried to convince me that I was hallucinating. But we had taken my car and my dad's car, and more than half of the equipment they had was mine, so they had no choice but to come back with me. As you can imagine, not everyone was happy with the decision. In fact, almost all of them got mad at me, and several of them took weeks to talk to me again. Others just didn't deal with me anymore. But I didn't care. They didn't see what I saw and didn't feel the terror that I did. I still wonder today what would have happened if I had accompanied that fake Sophia into the forest. What was that scary thing she wanted to show me? Because I couldn't imagine anything scarier than that very thing that was able to take the form of someone alive. It was too creepy just thinking about it. This horrible experience haunted me for months, so I decided to do some research on it to see if other people had ever experienced anything similar. And to my utter amazement, I found more than a dozen testimonies of people who had experienced creepy things in that place and all over the mountain area, but none similar to what happened to me. That explains why the area was so abandoned. The truth of the matter is that it took me almost 5 years to get up the courage to go camping again. When I was 12 years old, my father organized a trip to the mountains with 2 of his best friends and their children. My father had had the same 3 friends since he was in college. They were like brothers, and always got together to hang out or do outdoor activities such as fishing, going to the beach, or mountain climbing. They were so close that I used to call them uncles. Even today I still do. They will always be Uncle Thomas, Uncle Luis, and Uncle Fabricio. In the same way, I always had a very close relationship with their children, since we had similar ages and we used to see each other quite often. Besides, 3 of us attended the same school. These were Lucas, Mario, and me. But there were also Amanda, Leonardo, and Diana. They were Fabricio's children, but this time, for work reasons, their father could not attend the excursion. But he sent Leonardo, who would be in charge of Dad during the weekend. The girls preferred to stay. That day we left quite early, since we had packed everything the night before, so it was just a matter of getting up, having breakfast, getting ready, and leaving. We arrived at the edge of the mountain at about 10 a.m. after 3 long hours of walking. It was Friday, and the idea was to camp until Sunday. We had to get out of the car right there and continue on foot, because there was no road, just an old and pretty bad one. We walked along the trail for about 20 minutes, but it was quite a challenge from the beginning, because in several places the undergrowth had grown so much that the trail almost seemed to disappear. Somehow we always figured out where it was, but when we finally reached the campsite, we were surprised at how deserted the place was. It was just a clearing in the middle of the forest with a fire pit in the middle. I couldn't place it, but I had the feeling that there was something really creepy about this forest. All the time I had the feeling that there was someone lurking and watching us. We only had 2 tents, so we decided that Mario, Leonardo, Lucas, and I would share one, while Dad, Uncle Thomas, and Uncle Luis would share the other. Unusually, setting up the tents and arranging the space with all the stuff we brought practically took all day, and by the time it was all set up, it was slowly getting dark and we still had to go into the forest to look for tree trunks and make wood for a fire, so the boys and I volunteered to do it on our own. Our parents joked about us becoming men and stuff, and finally they said yes. It was hard work, but we were excited, and in fact, we were happy for the opportunity to get away from adults and grown-ups, because we knew we could then joke and fool around without fear of being reprimanded. We brought our flashlights and stayed close to camp, so we knew we would find our way back easily. As the sun was quickly going down, we began to gather as many pieces and logs as we could find. After quite a bit of searching, we finally managed to find more logs and starch that we returned to camp. We carried our loot, just as our parents were setting up the campfire, and after lighting it, we ate marshmallows and joked around for quite a while. The boys and I wanted to stay awake, but our parents said we had to go to bed, so we crawled into our tent. Of course, we didn't go to bed simply because the adults told us to. In fact, we stayed up long after they had gone to bed, laughing and talking to each other in whispers so they wouldn't know we were awake yet. But they also stayed up playing poker, joking around and drinking beer. However, after a while, they went to their tent and gradually the forest was getting quieter. But then, apart from our whispers and laughter, I noticed something strange. "What is that noise?" I said quietly. The others became silent and we all started to hear that strange noise through the forest. It sounded like chanting or more like humming, and the person's voice had a kind of strange tonality to it that made it sound even more frightening, creepy, like something from a horror movie. "Do you think, whoever it is, we can?" asked Mario in a whisper, but I put my finger to my lips to indicate that we had to be quiet. The sound was getting closer, and now we could hear branches rustling under someone's footsteps. This person, whoever it was approaching our camp humming a song. Now we were sure it was just that, a tune. The footsteps came closer to our tent, as did the song, which sounded much clearer. Suddenly there was a deathly silence and the footsteps stopped right in front of us. We were completely silent, petrified with fear, when suddenly that deathly silence was interrupted by a laugh. At that moment we were sure that the man standing in front of the tent was some kind of madman, because his laughter sounded unhinged. We were very surprised and frightened at the same time, for our parents' tent was about 5 or 6 meters from ours, not too close, but close enough that they could also hear this madman. Then we thought maybe they were too drunk to hear anything. This deranged laughter persisted for a few brief seconds, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, it simply died down. Everything went completely silent. But we didn't hear anyone move. That is, we didn't hear the man's footsteps leaving, yet somehow his presence faded. It no longer felt like he was in front of our tent. The guys and I looked at each other for a few seconds, completely terrified, and then Lucas and I went outside to take a look. Sure enough, the man was no longer in front of our tent. It was as if he had simply disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. There was nothing but stony silence in the whole place. However, a few seconds later, we began to hear that noise again, but now the distance, unmistakably, it was the same song we had heard before. Only now it sounded distant, as if it came from deep in the mountain and echoed throughout the place. A shiver ran through my whole body as I felt like my heart would burst out of my mouth at some point. The song lasted for about 10 minutes before finally fading away, but somehow I could still hear it in my head. It's the creepiest thing I've ever felt in my life. After a few minutes, Mario and I went back to the tent along with Lucas and Leonardo. But after a few hours, none of us could sleep. None of us except Leonardo, who seemed to be the only one able to fall asleep after that episode of terror we had just experienced. I was too terrified to want to stay another day in that place, so I told the boys that I would go to our parents' store and tell them what happened so they could take us back home. Mario said he would go with me, then Lucas insisted that he would go too. We tried to wake Leonardo, but he was sleepy as a block, so he only mumbled 2 things and fell asleep again. In the end, we decided to go, the 3 of us, and then come and wake him up so we could get the hell out of this place. We were too scared that this madman would be back as soon as the sun came up. So we ran to our parents' tent, woke them up and demanded that they take us home. We told them everything that had happened, but of course they didn't believe us. However, seeing the terror in our eyes, they realized that something really creepy must have happened to us. Finally, they told us to start packing up to leave at dawn, which was only about 2 or 3 hours away. So we went back to the tent to wake Leonardo up and start packing up. But when we got there, Leonardo was not there. At that moment, my heart dropped like a stone in my stomach. We started calling him, hoping he was somewhere nearby, peeing or something, but he wasn't answering. Seeing that we had called him several times and Leonardo was not answering, our parents became alarmed and started looking everywhere with flashlights. I can swear that I have never in my life been so scared and worried as I was at that moment. For the next few hours, we searched everywhere for Leonardo, but found no trace of him. Our parents called the police and at dawn the rangers, and they put together several search parties and combed the whole place by land and air. They searched for him until midnight, but they did not find a single trace of Leo. It was as if the earth had swallowed him up. But Mario, Lucas, and I knew perfectly well that whatever had happened to Leonardo was related to the man we saw, or rather, heard that night. The search for Leonardo went on for weeks with no results until it was finally officially called off. Leo's disappearance was not only a terrible tragedy, but it also marked everyone's lives, but especially that of his parents and ours. Dad felt guilty for years, and I think he did until his last day after all. Uncle Fabrizio left his son in his care, and he felt he had let him down. However, in spite of all the pain this meant to him, Uncle Fabrizio never blamed Dad. But unfortunately, it was not the same with the mother. She made enemies with my father from that day on, and I think she never forgave him. As for the others, I think I can speak to everyone when I say that, to this day, more than 20 years later, Leonardo's disappearance remains an unresolved issue, an open wound in everyone's heart that marked our lives forever. We never knew what really happened to him and may never know for sure. The boys and I talked several times about what we saw that night, but hardly anyone believed us. However, it is certain to me that whoever or whatever that guy in the woods was, he was the one who took our friend, When I was a child, my parents bought a beautiful property located in a quaint village at the foot of a mountain. This was a beautiful 2-story cabin that had a large forest surrounding it. We had already visited the place a couple of times, and my parents were so delighted that they were dying to buy a house there. And coincidentally, the opportunity came along just as I was about to celebrate my 11th birthday. So what better way to celebrate than by going away for a delightful weekend in our new mountain home? Fortunately, this Friday was a school holiday, so it was a perfect fit. When we arrived, I was very surprised to see how beautiful the house was and the spectacular space around it. The house was literally at the foot of the mountain, so this was our backyard. That's why I came up with a great idea. I told my parents that I wanted to camp outside for the weekend, since I had an area that was perfect to set up a tent, and it would be great for me, because it would be like being in the middle of the forest, but at the same time it was very close to the house. They agreed and also thought it was a great idea after all, so they would be close enough to take care of me if I needed them. Although from the look they gave each other, I think they both loved the idea of having more privacy. I spent the day sweeping leaves, setting up my tent, and buying food for camping. My parents even allowed me to have a small celebration group if I wanted, but I was very excited to camp alone. This was one of those things I always wanted to do, but thought I wouldn't get the chance until I was older, so I was very happy. The fire burned until around midnight, and I still had half a dozen cookies and a few bags of chips left. I spent that time reading comics by lamplight and keeping warm. Everything felt quiet around me. I could only hear the sound of the wind rustling the leaves on the trees. I know that can be scary for some people, but for some reason, for me it was very comforting. It still is. During the hours I was there, my parents came to give me a ride from time to time, but at that time I saw that they turned off the lights, which means they went to sleep. That night there was a new moon, so the night was dark, and the only light around was the fire I had just stoked so it wouldn't go out, and inside the tent, that of my old gas lantern. After I finished reading my book for the night and put out the fire, I decided to take a walk around the backyard. I wasn't quite sure why I wanted to do that, but I felt the need to. I started exploring the place by walking around. I don't know what the hell I was expecting, but I kept walking. When I got to the left corner of the house, I stopped and stared out into our next-door neighbor's yard. Here the houses were at some distance from each other, as they all had quite a yard, and since there was a fence in between, it didn't offer much visibility. I understood that the people living there were new to the area just like us, and my parents had planned to meet them between the fences. I approached and began to walk around the fence, running my hands through the wood. As I said before, I had no idea what I was doing. There was no plan in my head or anything to do. I was just letting my curiosity and my feet take me wherever they wanted to go, and at that moment, I just wanted to run my fingers through the neighbor's fence railings, but when I got to the end, I just retraced my steps back to my tent. I decided to turn off my lamp so my eyes could get used to the darkness and started walking around the side of the house back to my tent to try to get some sleep. But when I got to the end of the wooden wall and looked that way, I froze in place. By this time, my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, so I could see my tent swaying in the breeze, but what really made me stop was the figure I could make out, slowly approaching my camp. It was a tall man and he was wearing a jacket, definitely not my dad. This person moved slowly and methodically, as if he didn't want to be noticed. He was like an animal approaching its prey. He had closed all the zippers, so if he wanted to get in, he had to risk unzipping the tent and waking me up. Then I saw him pull right up to the entrance, stop and look toward the house again. The man stood in front of the store for a few seconds, as if analyzing his next move. It was then that I saw him reach out and very carefully begin to unzip the zipper very slowly, but in such a stealthy way that if I had been asleep in there, I surely would not have woken up. But as the man was opening the zipper extremely carefully with his right hand, I noticed that he moved his other hand to the back of his pants and pulled something out of his pocket. I couldn't make it out until the dim moonlight shone on the object. It was a knife. And when he moved his hand, I realized that it was a very large knife. Now I was really scared. I really didn't know whether to start screaming. Why, if I did, the man might run at me and before anyone could do anything, I would be dead. But on the other hand, I was terrified that my parents would come out and this madman would stab them with that knife. As I stood there, hiding behind the wall, all these thoughts were going through my head frantically, when suddenly I heard a boom, and then boom, again. 2 shotgun blasts, one after the other. I immediately gasped in shock, squeezed my eyes shut and covered my ears, but a second later I opened them, and then I could see the intruder running in terror through our backyard and getting lost in the mountain. Suddenly someone jumped over the fence behind me and started running after the guy, yelling at him to stop, and then shot him twice more. It all happened too fast. An instant later I saw the guy with the shotgun walking back through the woods. He was a middle-aged man, chubby and dressed in pajama pants and an open sleeping robe. He walked right up to my tent and started calling out to me, Kid, are you okay?" That's when I came out of hiding, waving my hands and telling him I was fine. At the same time, my parents came running out the back door asking in alarm what was going on. It turned out that the man was our next-door neighbor, who had a habit of staying up late, and at one point decided to peek out of his bedroom window located on the second floor of his house, and that's when he saw the man trying to enter my store with a knife in his hand. So he immediately grabbed his shotgun and fired 2 shots in the air and then ran out, jumped the fence and went after the guy, but the guy got away from him. Up to that point, we didn't know our next-door neighbors, but that action alone was enough to make us realize that they were good people. I was very lucky that night, both to be outside the store when this guy came into our yard, and to have a neighbor like Mr. Paul. After the incident, my parents filed a report, and fortunately the next day the town sheriff was able to arrest the guy because he broke his leg while running away from the neighbor and was unable to go deeper into the woods, but hid behind some bushes, where he was quickly found by search crews. Despite this bad experience, we celebrated my birthday on Sunday feeling reassured and thankful that nothing bad had happened in the end, and that this guy was behind bars. However, for more than obvious reasons, that was my first and last solo backyard camping trip. My name is Anna, and I am Colombian. My parents emigrated to the United States when I was 2 years old after facing a terrible family tragedy. My older brother died when he was 5 years old when he contracted a very rare parasitic disease which, because it was not treated properly, became complicated and ended his life. As you can imagine, this unfortunate tragedy significantly marked my parents' lives, and also mine, but not because I was aware of it, as I was very young at the time, but because thanks to that, my parents were always extremely overprotective of me, but in an almost suffocating way. My childhood was not like that of other children. I think that if they had had the possibility to put me in a bubble and isolate me from any external agent, they would have done it without a second thought. If a drizzle was falling, Mom would not let me leave the house, not even to school. The same happened when the temperature dropped a few degrees lower than normal, or there were even times when I did not go to school because it was cold in the morning. My parents' overprotection of me was really extreme, not to mention those times when I would inevitably get sick with something like the flu or whatever. It was a real nightmare. For this reason, I grew up without experiencing such normal things as sleepovers with school friends, school trips and things like that. Not to mention that my mother went everywhere with me. Even when I went to play with the kids on the street at whatever, she was there to keep an eye on me, even if we went bike riding. It was just exhausting. Needless to say, that overprotection made me the oddball at school, and therefore I didn't have many friends. But that was until I entered high school, and not because of them, but because of me. I was totally fed up with all their restrictions, and I felt too big to continue living under the constant custody of my parents. So I decided that when I reached this stage, I would be a completely different person, and I began to live a kind of double life. That is, at home I pretended to be the judicious and obedient girl that my parents wanted me to be. But at school I would float a kind of alter ego, that of an extroverted girl who boasted of having many freedoms, which obviously I didn't have in reality. I would always talk to my friends about all the things I had done at my other school, all the sleepovers I had with my old girlfriends that never really existed, how much fun I had on field trips I never went on, and the like. I also ran away from home to go to parties, smoked and drank, which was excessive, I know, but I was a teenager whose parents had deprived her whole life of experiencing the normal things every school kid does, so I just went a little crazy. And I don't even know how I managed to keep them from ever finding out about my antics. Of course, I always tried to maintain an excellent average, and in their eyes, I pretended to be very straight, so that neither of them would suspect even a little bit of what I was doing behind their backs. Everything went smoothly for a while. My friends thought I was a very cool person, going to all the parties and making a racket, while my parents still believed that I was their perfect and tender daughter, whose picture was always on the honor roll at school. At the time, I thought I had it all under control, I was getting out of the school trips my parents wouldn't let me go on, saying they were too silly for me and pretending to be way above it. And I dare say that gave me extra cool points. However, that foolproof excuse began to falter when my friends told me that they had already gotten everything for the camp they always went to during summer vacation. The year before, I had managed to dodge the bullet with the excuse that I hated sleeping in a tent, and if one day they got an RV, which was how I preferred to camp, they would let me know. Truth be told, I felt like a total genius at the time, because I didn't think they could pull something like that off, so I thought my life of lies would be safe until college. But I didn't count on the fact that they really wanted me to go, and that the cousin of one of my friends had an RV that he was willing to rent to us for a small fee. When my friend arrived to tell me the happy news, I almost had a panic attack. Obviously, my parents would never let me go to a camp like that. Firstly, because it was the whole weekend, and secondly, because for them this was a perfect breeding ground for anything to happen to me, from being attacked by a drunk teenager or under the influence of some substance, to being bitten by a snake or catching any disease that might be lurking in the woods waiting for a victim like me. I had no idea what I could do, either to get out of going or to make my parents have no choice but to give me permission. I thought of everything from forging a mandatory hiking permit to faking my own disappearance. At this point, the entire reputation I had built up through very credible lies was at stake, and I felt very desperate. Logically, there were quite a few flaws in my strategies, but I had to come up with something. In the end, I decided that my best plan was to tell them the truth, but not the whole truth. I would just tell them that I wanted to go to a little camp organized by my friends, who were also on the honor roll, of course, without telling them the real location. In case it didn't work out, I would escape and they couldn't ruin it by coming after me or calling the police. Their first reaction, obviously, was to refuse, but I finally convinced them, almost begging them to let me go and reminding them that I deserved it for being on the honor roll for another year. My father was the most receptive, but my mother disagreed. However, in the end she reluctantly agreed, as my father talked some sense into her. I couldn't believe my luck because I was absolutely sure that they were not going to leave me. However, this was not going to be so easy. My mother put a lot of conditions on me beforehand. The first one was to always answer her absolutely every message, and she also had to have my location in real time all the time, from the Friday I left the house until the day I returned. He also made me swear to him that I would not drink a single drop of alcohol, and that I would stay away from any possible danger and not eat strange things. I agreed without raising any objection. Anyway, I knew that I could be a totally different person when I got away from them. When the day arrived, I was the most excited of the whole group. On the outside, I tried to act nonchalant, but inside I was completely elated. I couldn't believe I was finally attending my first camp at the age of 17. When we arrived at the place, I had to give the real location to my mom, with the lie that in the end my friends had decided that this new place was much safer, and there were guards. That was the complete opposite of what the reality was, as we were going deep into the woods so we wouldn't have any adult supervision. And once I was there, it became clear to me why they were so insistent that I go to this camp every year. The place was completely crazy. I really thought there would be at most 10 or 15 of us. But what I found when I got there was nothing more than a bunch of tents around my friend's big RV. Without exaggerating, I think there must have been at least 50 or 60 boys, girls, and the like in that place, all from different schools. I was in heaven. This was everything I had dreamed of since I entered puberty. My parents had deprived me of so many things because of their excessive fear of something bad happening to me, that experiencing things like this that are so normal for teenagers were almost an impossible dream for me. So it didn't take long for me to join the group and start having fun with my friends and meeting new people. As I was hanging out with some of my friends around the campfire, We saw a group of guys running around throwing beer and bits of food at each other. I guess they were from another school because I didn't know any of them. Suddenly, one of them came running after the other with a pot of ketchup in his hand and started chasing him. The first one, trying to get away from his friend dousing him in ketchup, ran right towards where we were when the other one almost caught up with him. At that moment, his friend, who seemed to be quite drunk, started throwing ketchup at him, and the idiot hid behind me, grabbing me by the arms and using me as a shield, so I was the one who ended up with a shirt full of ketchup. I was logically very angry, and so were my friends I was with at the bonfire. "Hey, what's wrong with you idiots? Don't you see what you just did?" shouted Anthony, grabbing the one with the sauce by the shirt and pushing him away from me, while Julia and Victoria threw a glass of beer in the face of the other fool who held me. I took a couple of swings at him too when he let go of me. The pair of idiots apologized and continued their stupid game away from us, but now I had a shirt full of ketchup and had to go change. I told the guys to wait for me for a while I went to the RV to wash up a bit and change clothes. The RV was locked, as only my friends and I could get in, so I grabbed the keys and unlocked it. All my buddies were having fun outside, so it was totally empty. I hurried to grab my suitcase to take out a clean shirt and was deep in my thoughts when suddenly my phone rang. It was my mother, so I answered the message quickly, went to wash up a bit, put on my shirt, and then I was ready to get out of there. However, when I opened the door to leave, I almost ran head-on into a guy. He was of medium height, dark, had on a white t-shirt, sweatpants, and was barefoot. He was a little strange. He was standing in front of the door of the trailer, with his arms folded across his chest. His eyes were wide open, and he was staring at me. I saw that his hair was wet and dripping water on his face, but on closer detail I realized that it wasn't just his hair. He was totally soaked, and there was a puddle of water under his feet. This seemed too weird to me, but then I remembered that up ahead there was a lake, and I heard a group of kids from another school say they were going swimming in it, so I assumed it was coming from there. We were both silent for a moment until I asked, "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" He didn't answer me right away. He just kept looking at me, but then he smiled at me and told me his name was Sebastian, but nothing else. Then I asked him again what he was doing there, and he shrugged and told me nothing in particular. He was just attracted by the caravan. That answer seemed a little strange to me. After all, the caravan had been there since early in the morning. Why would he only now come to see it? When I got out of the caravan, he asked me my name, and I answered that my name was Anna. He told me it was a nice name, and we started to talk. I confess that at first I thought he had come there with the intention of stealing something, but once I started talking to him, he seemed like a nice guy. However, there was something strange about him. I couldn't really say what it was, but there was just something that didn't quite fit. The only way I can describe it is as if he felt distant, empty. I don't know if that feeling makes sense to any of you, but it's the only way I could describe it. We were talking for quite a while, but only about trivial things. He told me that he was studying in another school, and that he used to come to this camp every year since 5 years ago. That caught my attention, because this guy couldn't be more than 18 years old, and this camp was for high school kids, so it seemed to me that it didn't make any sense, but I didn't want to refute him. I just thought he was wrong in his words. But as we continued talking, I noticed a couple of other strange things. The first one is that by then it was getting late in the afternoon and it was getting a bit cold, but he didn't seem to feel it even though he was soaked from head to toe, and that was the other thing. We talked for a long time, and as we did so, at one point we moved from the door of the caravan to a tree a few yards away to get under its shade. But despite the cool breeze and the afternoon sun, he never seemed to dry out. There was still a puddle of water under his feet, and his hair was still completely soaked and dripping water on his face. I asked him if he wanted to borrow a towel or something to dry himself, but he waved his hands and said he didn't need it. Suddenly, my friend started calling out to me, and I realized that I had been talking to this guy for over an hour and I had completely forgotten about them. The guys started yelling at me to go fast, or I would run out of hamburger. Then I remembered that I had not eaten anything, and I told Sebastian that he could come and stay with us for a while, and I also offered him a hamburger. But then he gave me an answer that at the time did not make any sense to me, but now it does. He said, "No thanks, I'm not hungry anymore." I found his choice of words curious, but I didn't think anything of it. I just told him where I would be, and that he could catch me there whenever he wanted. That way I could introduce him to my friends who were very cool, but he just smiled at me and told me it was fine. I said goodbye to him, and then walked towards the campfire. I only took a couple of steps before I turned around to ask him where his group was, but he was gone. It was very strange because I literally only took a couple of steps. Where could he have gone so fast? As before, I didn't think much of it and went back to my friends. The day went by, and I didn't see Sebastian again. Not even the next one, even though I looked for him among all the groups of kids in the camp, but I didn't see him anywhere. I asked several people and nobody seemed to know him, so I wondered if maybe he had lied to me and had come on his own. But I didn't think he was a dangerous person since he never said or did anything inappropriate while I was talking to him. We just talked, and that was it. Sunday had finally arrived, and this was our last day at camp. That day the boys decided to go to the lake for a swim. Saturday had been hiking, and then there was a good bonfire party, so it seemed perfect that after the hangover we would take a moment to go swimming in the lake. However, when we arrived at the site, Albert, the driver of our RV and one of only 3 adults there, seriously warned us about not straying far from the shore, as this lake was large, and beyond the buoy marker, there were underwater currents that could be very dangerous. At that moment, I heard someone from another group say, "Right, guys, we don't want a repeat of Sebastian." My head immediately turned to him, but just as I was about to ask him about it, one of my friends grabbed me by the arm and dragged me into the water. Once there, we started joking and enjoying the moment, so I forgot about it. A few hours later, when we were packing up to leave, I saw in the crowd the guy I heard talking about Sebastian. The truth is that I was very curious. After all, it is not such a common name in this country, so I decided to approach him and ask him about what he had said a while ago. "Hi, I'm Anna and I'm with the caravan group," I said, pointing towards where my friends were bringing things up. "Oh, a pleasure, Anna. I'm Edwin." We shook hands, and seeing that the guys already had almost everything ready in the caravan, I asked her all at once, "Hey, I heard you talking about a Sebastian. Who is he and what happened to him?" "Oh, that. Well, Sebastian was my best friend's older brother. He drowned in this lake 5 years ago." Hearing this, my heart started pounding, because it immediately came to my mind what the Sebastian I met a couple of days ago told me. I usually come to this camp every year for the last 5 years. I was beginning to worry. Could it be possible? No, of course not. It must be a coincidence, I thought to myself. So I asked him, "What was it like? What happened?" It was then that he told me that this had happened on the first day of his last camp, since that year was his graduation. It seems that he and his friends made a stupid challenge to swim to the buoy, but at that time it was night and everyone was very drunk, including Sebastian. So he and 2 friends made a run for it. The 3 of them jumped into the water and started swimming, while all the buddies cheered and shone flashlights on them. Sebastian was a great swimmer, so he won the race. But instead of turning back like the others did, he celebrated by swimming past the buoy, diving in and then jumping out of the water like some kind of dolphin. To his teammates, this was hilarious, and they began cheering his name as he continued to clown around in the water. However, The laughter turned to horror when Sebastian dove in after a big jump and didn't come out again. At first, everyone thought he was playing a joke on them, so it wasn't until after a few minutes that his companions jumped into the water to try to get him out. But they didn't find him. What they did find was a strong underwater current that almost swallowed another of his companions as he tried to find him. That night, his friends searched everywhere for him, both in and out of the lake, holding out hope that perhaps the current had pulled him to shore, but he was not found. For the next 2 days, a specialized search team combed this entire stretch of the lake trying to find Sebastian, but it wasn't until 3 days later that his body washed up floating near a nearby village. Hearing this story made my hair stand on end. This was truly tragic and chilling, but as he was telling me this story, I couldn't help but imagine the Sebastian I had talked to a couple of days ago, being the boy they were telling me about. So I asked Edwin what Sebastian looked like, and he replied, "Oh, if you want, I'll show you. There's a little memorial chapel near the lake where there's a picture of him." Of course, I asked him to take me, even though all the way there my heart was beating like a drum in my ears and my hands were in a cold sweat. I know it seemed stupid, but I needed to make sure it was just a coincidence. I felt a little silly just considering it was the same person, but I had to kill the uneasiness. However, when I finally got to the chapel, all the color drained from my face and I felt like I was going to pass out. Not only was this not only the same Sebastian I met in the caravan, but he was dressed exactly the same. He was even barefoot. "Are you feeling okay?" Edwin asked me with a worried look on his face. I imagine my shock was more than noticeable. I answered yes, and made up that I was just being affected by the heat. He nodded and told me that photo had been taken that same day, just before the race. That's why I was shoeless. Feeling short of breath, I turned around and walked towards the caravan, leaving Edwin behind without saying a word. As I was getting in, I turned around for a moment and could see Edwin looking at me with a face like, "What the hell is wrong with this girl?" But I didn't pay any attention. I just got in the caravan and sat down without saying a word until we arrived back in town. I was so shocked. I don't even know what happened around me on the ride. I guess my companions tried to talk to me or mumbled things, but I have no idea, as in my head I was just replaying the movie of the madness I had just experienced, so I just wanted to get home as soon as possible and get away from that place. I never told anyone about this experience until a couple of years ago, when I entered the university and met Sebastian's brother by chance, since we were both studying the same career. The first time I saw him, I almost had a heart attack because he was almost identical to his brother. But then, we became good friends. However, it wasn't until about 8 or 10 months later that I dared to tell him about my experience with Sebastian, at the risk of him thinking I was crazy. But to my relief, he believed me, and even told me that he himself had met his brother on a couple of occasions, and that he had not dared to tell anyone about it either. His name is Sergio, and we are good friends to this day. But that meeting with Sebastian is something I will never forget in my life.